Hello everyone, and welcome to the 9th lecture of True Dhamma following in the footsteps of the Buddha. This time around we start with chapter 4 on the mundane right view, which is the first real content chapter that exceeds the limits of just motivational content, while I was also sprinkling a lot of Dhamma into all those lectures. This time around it is essentially about the first very essential step on the Buddhist path, namely the mundane right view. In case that you do not know me and are here for the first time for this lecture, my name is Dr. Florian Lau and I'm from the Dhamma Hub YouTube channel. But anyway, let us begin with the content. Last time we analyzed the going forth and what going forth even means when it comes to all the Buddhist literature, where going forth is a very common concept, and it means going forth to the Dhamma, namely understanding the teaching of the Buddha sufficiently that you accept it as your guide from now on. This time around we will mainly focus on the aspect of the left side of this column. I would assume that this lecture will be split in 2 parts and will be in total roughly 2 hours long, the first video being 1 hour. So the first thing we analyze today is why most knowledge seems useless to us. Even most knowledge on Dhamma that is presented in this lecture may be. I'm not sure if you would consider it useless. While I have handpicked literally every line that I put in here, only a fraction of that will appear useful to you. And this is perfectly normal. This is, by the way, why rewatching lectures when your knowledge changes has such immense value, especially when it is about a Dhamma, as Dhamma might be the one topic with the most depth of all topics around there. Then we will have the next story time, which is about the very early days of the Buddha, where he accumulated the first followers and started to really put in motion the wheel of the Dhamma, as he puts it, namely send out all his new followers to also teach what they have learned to assist him in the process of spreading the teachings on, dependent origination pretty much. Then we have one slide or one section on you versus the world, or why the Buddha always focused on you as a person and not on the society as a whole. You should always make sure to fix yourself first, in the words of the Buddha, before you start focusing on other people. The next section is on fingers to the moon, or the limitations of language. And this one might be the most important section of them all for any early practitioner who has not yet attained the right view, namely the understanding of dependent origination, the understanding of Dhamma. And the next section is about the right view before Sotapaddi, which is what the Buddha called the mundane right view, which is the absolute necessary precondition for making a breakthrough to the Dhamma, namely to becoming a stream enterer. Without the skills that the Buddha named in the mundane right view, it is absolutely impossible to attain to the real right view. And then in the second part of the lecture that will be held next time, we discuss very popular wrong views that people keep repeating all the time, and sometimes they attribute those very wrong views to the Buddha nowadays. Then we have more on the mundane right view and some element about practice versus meditation, because nowadays people think that meditation is very limited to the meditation cushion, which is absolutely not true. When the Buddha talked about meditation, it was very rarely about sitting on a cushion. Sitting is just a very convenient posture. It is one posture where there is the least amount of distraction going on. This is why he had advised it most of the time for beginners, which makes it easier for them to learn the skills necessary for spiritual development in a rather sheltered external environment. And then we discuss the definitions of mind states and very important words and concepts at the end to give you an idea and an overview about what must be cultivated and what must be achieved, what must be understood to make good progress. And last but not least, we also have a summary and in the end the typical content about questions and answers, etc. And in case you are new here, at the bottom of the slides you always see a small orange bar that shows the overall progress of the entire lecture. The progress, the orange progress between the second to last and the last dot, is always a progress of this lecture, and all the others represent or resemble the prior lectures that we have already been going through. But anyway, let us now begin with 5 minutes of mindfulness meditation or non-reactivity that are obviously optional. You don't have to do that, but it's a very good idea to do it. You could sit down. I will obviously not wait with you for 5 minutes, but you can pause the video. You could sit down for 5 minutes and just practice emotional non-reactivity. Sit there in meditation and do absolutely nothing. When faced with an urge, with a craving to scratch yourself, to change your posture, to think about something, to indulge in some thought chain, some fantasizing, try not to do that. Try to deny your mind the wish to actually go for all those things. It is a very good idea, and it cultivates this very necessary skill of restraint and enduring of bad feelings. Without those skills, it is very, very difficult to make any kind of progress when it comes to spirituality, especially in the beginning. A very high degree of restraint is absolutely crucial. In the beginning, the mind is like a wild animal that has to be tamed so that you can actually command it to do the right things that are necessary for spiritual progress. But anyway, I will now pause for a moment so that you can pause the video, do the 5 minutes if you wish, and then we will continue. Okay, I assume that you are done now, and now we can begin with the real content. And I want to start with the first section, why knowledge seems useless in the beginning. And the Buddha had quite a few things to say on those topics. And the first citation, this time we have 2 on this slide, I want to read to yourself, and it's pretty much called The Uninterested Worldling, and it is from Majjhima Nikaya number 105. And the Buddha pretty much said that when a person is intent on worldly material things, only talk concerning that interests him, and the thinking and pondering are in line with that, and he associates with that kind of person. But when talk on Dhamma, namely world-transcending talk, is going on, he will not listen to it. He will not give an ear and exert his mind to understand it. This is, by the way, why basically most people in the entire world will never actually encounter the Dhamma or make an effort at understanding it, because they are simply not interested in it. They are interested in the worldly material things. They are 100% convinced that happiness can be found in the material goods in the world, despite the overwhelming evidence that it cannot be found there. As a spiritual practitioner, we obviously know all of this, but most people in the world have a very strong tendency of ignoring the impermanence of everything they are striving for, and thus they are striving for it and trying their best to get what they want, thinking that it will make them happy, despite overwhelming evidence in form of studies, by the way, or as an example, that suggests otherwise. For example, unlimited money won't make you happy. Studies are very clear on that. Buying a house won't make you happy. Studies are very clear on that. Most of the happiness is derived from the idea of having a house and from comparing ourselves with others. But others can just buy something that is even nicer, and then our happiness is gone that we derive from comparison. And the Buddha was very clear on all of this, and he was pointing us to the fact that even spiritual practitioners will only be interested in one thing at a time. For example, in the same sutta, the Buddha was talking about some practitioners who try to develop the first jhana, and they are only interested in that. Their thinking and pondering will only be directed towards that, and they will only, really associate with people who also try to cultivate the first jhana. And the same is true for basically any other, spiritual attainment that you could strive for, or any other understanding that you could strive for. For example, he repeated the same statement for the second, the third, the fourth, for the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth jhana. All of that is also true in spiritual circles. People always try to, make it so that their surrounding pretty much reflects what they try to be good at. And again, I have forgotten to start my timer so that I don't overdo it, but I will repeat that now and just assume that I've done about 7 minutes of talking by now. And the Buddha also gave us a second citation, which is also very important, this time from Anguttara Nikaya 7.68. I will move a bit to the side so that you could scan the QR code if you wish to read up the sutta for yourself. But also you can always go to suttacentral.com, I think, and always look up the suttas for yourself by the very number. It's very easy. You can just plug it into the URL and then you go there pretty much. And the Buddha said in that sutta, "And how is a monk one with a sense of time? This is the time for recitation. This is the time for questioning. This is the time for making an effort in meditation. And this is the time for seclusion. Every kind of practice that you have has a time, and every bit of information you might be looking for also has the right time. So you cannot just go in there and try to understand something that is far beyond your scope or possibility of understanding, simply because you do not fulfill the necessary preconditions. Every piece of practice has a time. If you have not acquired the right view yet, jhana practice is very likely not for you, as an example. Or if you have not yet the intention to give up on sensuality and addiction, then jhana practice is definitely not for you, because any type of jhana you will acquire will be something that you acquire through your craving for more, through your craving for pleasure. And jhana is beyond pleasure. Jhana is nice because you are no longer subjected to all the kinds of feelings, so you moved above feelings as a whole, and this is what makes them nice. It is a type of relief and not a type of pleasure as we know it. It's not something we experience on account of getting something, on account of cultivating something. It is far more than that. But yeah, as you can see, the Buddha was very intent on showing us that we will not see everything as beneficial right now, but that does not mean that we will not see it as beneficial in the future. So if you are right now interested in the first jhana, then by all means watch this lecture as an example with the intention to learn more about jhana. But as soon as you want to cultivate something else, for example, the right view, then by all means, there is a lot of value in repetitive watching of Dhamma talks. As an example, some videos on Dhamma I have watched like 9 times. Some books on meditation I have read 6 times. And there is really no shame in that, because every time you will discover more. There are multiple layers to all the suttas that the Buddha gave as an example. And again, some of them I have read or analyzed many times to get to the meaning of them. While I have read all of them, some of them I have read many times. But anyway, let us continue. The entire process can also be illustrated with this kind of map that I really like to use as a metaphor to make it easier to understand. In the background, we have the map of, I call it the map of self-growth or self-improvement, where all the areas of interest are listed. The lighter the color, the closer to the beginning something is, and the deeper and darker the color, the more toward the end of your self-improvement or self-transcendence journey you are. To the very right side, we obviously have enlightenment and meditation, and those very deep goals. But most beginners start at the very left side of the map, and everyone has a circle of interest around them, and only things that are within that circle, things that are similar enough to what we are already doing, are of interest to us. So we cannot simply choose something like enlightenment as someone who plays video games. And 99% of the cases, as an example, we have to move through this landscape by shifting and changing our desires and interests very slowly, so that we can actually move towards the end goal that we might have and actually become happy for good or start meditating or something like that. But in the beginning, that is simply not possible. It is in fact impossible. We can only really establish a habit that our mind is interested in. We have to work with our desires in the beginning and only make tiny changes to it. Otherwise, the mind will rebel. The Buddha was always very clear that his training is a gradual training. It's a practice. It's an ingraining of something, a gradual training, striving. It requires effort, constant repetition, drilling. And he was very clear on that. He even called it manly effort, manly strength, manly striving. Those were the words of his time. But the gist of it is very clear. You have to make an effort, a constant effort, all the time. And then, as a result, you can reach the final goal. It is not something that is just handed to you as a special experience in meditation. Not at all. It is an understanding, and understanding comes through the effort of understanding. And in the same way, no matter where we start on such a map, no matter what interests we start with, we always have to make an effort to move towards the final vague goal or vision that we have by progressing through more immediate things. And whenever we establish a new habit, we move along this map, and new areas will become accessible to us that we can try to cultivate and pick the best one from, as an example. So if we have multiple choices within our circle of interest, then we can make an intelligent choice that moves us further towards our final goal. So I call this principle the principle of carryover, pretty much, so that you can actually use the positive benefits of something that you do right now to achieve something in the future that is worthwhile achieving. So by not really moving towards your goal in a very targeted manner, you can still move towards your goal simply by carryover, by picking a habit that also makes you better at what you try to achieve ultimately. But anyway, let us continue. Now to the fourth story time of this lecture. And this time around, it is about the first 5 disciples of the Buddha, and the story is from Majjhima Nikaya 26 and 85. Where the Buddha, just being enlightened and leaving the different trees he was sitting under, moves to the group of 5 people he was practicing severe asceticism with. The Buddha was the king of all ascetics, who nearly starved himself to death in multiple ways, and he really tried everything to reach liberation by the means of asceticism, by depriving himself of pretty much everything that is considered pleasant, because people at that time were thinking that the problem is in pleasure and not in the craving towards the pleasure, as an example, which is what the Buddha later discovered. And this time around, he came back with a new knowledge to find those 5 people, because he knew that they were very diligent practitioners who had very good conditions, and those people knew him very well, so they could receive information from him without doubting him too much. And those 5 people were kind of delighted to see him back, but did not really want to show it, because the ascetic Gautama reverted to luxuries by eating again, because he needed his strength for his spiritual striving. You cannot really strive spiritually when you are depleted and without any energy. So he started eating again, and they took that kind of personal, and they didn't want to associate with the Buddha again. Yet the Buddha attained the full liberation of mind by eating again, because he needed that energy. And the Buddha wanted to teach them, but they were doubtful in the beginning as he stopped his self-torture. But after a while, he convinced them of his liberation, and he taught them the Dhamma, the middle way. He taught them the 4 noble truths, and then there was one of those people, namely Kodanna, and he attained the fruit of stream entry first. The teaching has been set in motion at that time, because he was successful in teaching at least one other person the Dhamma, the way out of suffering. And once you understood the Dhamma, namely attained stream entry, then the stream, this is why it is called stream entry, will carry you with it on its own. So you incorporate it so much into the context of Dhamma that from now on it will happen on its own, more or less. It can take a while, especially when you are deeply into sensuality, as an example. But yeah, after a while you will end up at final liberation once you understood the Dhamma at any point in time. And then the other 4 ascetics also attained stream entry, namely then Vappa, then Badiya, then Mahanama, and then Asaji, last of the 5. And then a discourse on non-self has been given from the Buddha to the 5 ascetics, and they attained arahantship a bit later, which is also very important. That said, some people use that as a justification to teach non-self or the 3 marks only after understanding the 4 noble truths. But that is not really how the Buddha taught it. When the Buddha talked about anything related to Dhamma, he always talked about non-self. To really understand what Dhamma really is, and namely attaining stream entry, you have to understand the 3 marks. Some people, like Thanissaro Bhikkhu, I think, say that it has to happen in the context of the 4 noble truths. But then again, the 4 noble truths kind of contain the teaching of dependent origination, which is the teaching on the Dhamma, which is the teaching of the 3 marks that you have to understand. And the ignorance that you have to remove to understand the 4 noble truths is the ignorance of the 3 marks. When he says that, I think he means that that all of this has to happen on the basis of virtue, on the basis of non-craving. And this is true, by the way. You have to be very virtuous to even make a breakthrough to the Dhamma. Otherwise, you will misconceive the Dhamma through your craving and completely misunderstand it and won't gain anything out of it. So there has to be a very solid foundation of restraint, enduring, and all those things. Otherwise, you cannot make a breakthrough to the Dhamma. And then the Buddha moved on, while the 5 new disciples enjoyed the fruit of their new liberation. And he encountered a clansman named Yasa, who was very rich and had many friends. And at some point, he was having a very strong experience of terror with all the pleasures around him. And he realized that those were impermanent. And he went out and pretty much fled from his environment. And then he encountered the Buddha. As a result, his father went searching for him, and his mother and former wife also went searching for him. And each of them successively also encountered the Buddha, who taught them the Dhamma. And all of them at least attained stream entry through the discourses of the Buddha, while Yasa, the householder at that time, even attained arahantship upon hearing the teaching. And after a while, more and more of the former friends of Yasa came there because they were inspired. How could such a rich and noble householder become a monk, as an example? So they were intrigued and also went to the Buddha, and he gave each of them a discourse on the Dhamma. And after a while, there were 61 arahants in total. And then the Buddha started talking to them, to all those new arahants, and sent them out in all directions to teach the Dhamma. He pretty much said, there are beings with little dust on their eyes who will be lost through not hearing the Dhamma. Some will understand the Dhamma. This is a citation also from the listed suttas that I gave you. So yeah, what he says is that there are people with very good preconditions. They have very little dust on their eyes. So they could understand the Dhamma when they hear it, because they have fulfilled all the necessary preconditions. And the only thing that is missing is the utterance of another. They have to hear the Dhamma from another, because it goes against the grain of the world. You pretty much cannot discover it on your own. You have to hear it from someone else, either from the Buddha himself or from someone who has learned it from the Buddha. And this is very important, by the way. There has to be a first person who discovered the Dhamma. And by the very definition the Buddha gave us, this is what a Buddha is. A person who discovered the Dhamma on their own in a period of time without any Dhamma. This is a definition from a Buddha. Someone who became enlightened without the help of another person. So there can only be one Buddha at any given time. This is also very important to keep in mind. Later traditions of Buddhism kind of redefined the word Buddha and made it to be just an enlightened one. This is, for example, the opinion in the Mahayana traditions, if I remember that correctly. But this is not what the Buddha said. The Buddha was very clear on the fact that a Buddha is someone who attains awakening by their own efforts without the help of another person. And this is what the Buddha did. He attained the Dhamma on his own. Very important to keep in mind. So yeah, so he sent them out to teach all the other people, and we will continue in the next lecture with how the story went on. But now we will have a small part or section on why the Buddha advised us to focus on ourselves first and disregard everything else in the world, pretty much. And yeah, first of all, I want to give you a short slide on so-called scapegoats. Most people's mindsets start, especially young people's mindset starts with the attitude that there is always someone else to blame for your misfortune. Especially for younger people, it is usually the parents that are to blame for all the shortcomings. When you cannot go on some field trip because your parents are too poor, then your parents are to blame. And in a sense, they play a part in the misfortune of yours, which is very clear. But in the end, the older you get, the smaller the role of your parents gets. And in essence, no matter the age, people will pretty much always find someone else to blame. And if it is not the spouse or the parent, the partner, or very close friends, then there is always the system which can be blamed for your own suffering. It can be politics, it can be capitalism, the patriarchy, the rich people who take all the money from someone else. The gist of all of this is that it is always external events, and thus cosmic misfortune that is to blame for your shortcomings. And the meta implication from all of this is that there is always something else that has to change, or someone else that has to change, and not us. Which is a very inviting thing, by the way, to do, because it means we do not have to invest the effort to change. It has to be someone else that changes. And this is very much with the grain of the world, which is why it is so inviting to come to that conclusion, because coming to another conclusion would mean very, very much work. And all of those scapegoats are pretty much wrong. The cause of our suffering is always in us and in our attitude toward the world, and not in the world of the senses around us, which is incredibly important to keep in mind. And one of the prime reasons why the Buddha advised us to look for problems in ourselves and try to overcome problems in ourselves. And now I want to give you a small experiment on why that is the case, why it is always our attitude pretty much that is to blame for suffering. And again, this is a small exercise. Please only do the first block first, then ponder a bit while pausing the video, and then you can read the answer. So first of all, try imagine sitting in front of your favorite dish, whatever you like to eat the most. Choose something that you really love and could eat literally every day for the foreseeable future. You can have as much as you want of it, and there is always more available. If you wish, you can do it for real instead of just imagining this. to have a more profound effect. And let's assume that you ate a few portions and are now really full. After finishing, you can ask yourself the following question. Do you still want to eat more? And now you can pause the video and think for a moment. But yeah, I will continue now. The answer is very likely no. Of course it is no. You are full now. However, has anything about the dish changed? And again, the answer is very, very clearly no. The dish is absolutely identical to what it was before. The only change that took place is in your mind. You are responsible for your perception of that dish. Your interpretation of the dish is what makes it good or bad. Your mind judges the dish as good or bad. It is not in the dish. It is in your mind. And this is why suffering is something that is deeply personal. One person can judge some event, some external circumstances as really bad, while another can really rejoice in those external circumstances. After all, the dish, as an example, has not changed a tiny bit. And you can, by the way, transfer the results of this small exercise or experiment to basically any other situation. When someone is a jerk, by the way, to you, or completely disagreeable to you, then, and this might come as a real surprise, then it is not a quality of that person usually. It is your judgment of that person that makes you dislike them. And this is a really hard pill to swallow for many people. And it, in fact, took me a while to accept that too. This is not something that comes very natural. It has to be cultivated, a mindset like that, to really acknowledge that it is your judgment that makes people good or bad, and not the people in themselves, as an example. With people, it is especially clear that they are clearly completely a-holes or something like that. But yeah, it is not in the people, it is in our mind, and this is very important. So the result of all of this is pretty much that there are things that you can control, namely this tiny orange bubble, and then there are a lot of things that are beyond your control, namely all the other people or the entire world and the system around us. You can barely even control yourself, which is very in line with the truth of non-self of the Buddha. And then there is all the other things that you can control even less. So your entire focus should really be directed at those things that you could control. This is very important. All the other things that are clearly beyond your control should be none of your concern in the beginning. Once you fixed yourself and attained, for example, the right view, then you can also branch out if you choose to, and choose to help other people, at least when it comes to the teaching of Dhamma. But it is the same with anything, really. If you know how to fix cars, as an example, then you can teach others how to fix cars. But for that, you first have to acquire that skill, and don't try to help people, as an example, without having that skill to help people. And if you try to fix people's emotions for the better, you must know the way out of bad emotions before. You must know how to transcend feelings and emotions. And again, this is a skill that is situated in that tiny bubble that should be even smaller. Those are the controllable things, the things that you can directly influence. All the other things are so hard to influence. If you ever try to convince a political opponent of something, then it should be very clear. It is hard enough to go against your own senses and against your own inclinations. You have no idea how hard it is, how much harder it is to really influence another person who does not want to be influenced. You can only trigger something in someone else, as for example improvement, if they wanted it anyway. Then you can plant a small seed, as an example. But apart from that, your control is extremely limited. You can basically only supply suggestions to them. They have to accept them, they have to implement them. In the end, the responsibility of something is always with the individual. This is also something that is very foreign for many people. For example, if you get insulted by someone, it is your choice if you feel insulted. And this is a very, very disagreeable concept for many people. If someone insults me, yeah, fine, sure, you can insult me. The Buddha also gave a very interesting simile on that. There was once an ascetic who was insulting the Buddha greatly, and the Buddha was just calmly sitting there smiling and enduring it. And after a while he asked them, what do you do with people who come along? Do you give them gifts? Do you give them presents when you visit them? And he said, of course I do that. Why shouldn't I? This is common knowledge that that's something great that you do. And then the Buddha asked him again, what if those people don't want those gifts? And then he asked him, well, then I take it with me again. What's the problem with that? And yeah, in the same way the Buddha said, you can keep your insults. I don't want them. You can keep them. And this was a very baffling answer for that ascetic, who was not expecting that at all. But anyway, let us continue. Now to a very important slide on self-focus. And the Buddha pretty much said that people love to fix others to avoid their own problems. This can be a cope. You can have a very noble-seeming outer attitude, while in reality, you only really try to avoid your own problems, because those seem far harder to fix than fixing the problems of the world, which is why many people try to fix the world and not themselves. They are clearly in a very bad emotional state, but still they try to focus on everything but themselves. And the Buddha very much condemned this kind of behavior in the Dhammapada in chapter 12. In line 165, he pretty much said the following: by oneself is evil done, by oneself is one defiled, by oneself is evil left undone, by oneself is one made pure. Purity and impurity depend on oneself, no one can purify another. And in line 166 he continues, let one not neglect one's own welfare for the sake of another, however great. Clearly understanding one's own welfare leads, let one be intent upon the good. And this is a very powerful line, because people always try to find a line where it is better to help someone else at the expense of yourself. And the Buddha was very clear on that. No, this is never better. You should always focus on yourself first. And this is not egoistic in any way, because fixing yourself will help other people, because you are a net negative influence on the world when you are in a bad state. Simply by your own presence, as we have learned in chapter 2, where we talked a lot about the motivation and the effect of our emotions on others. Simply by removing your own bad emotions from the equation, you already make the world a much better place. And other people can be inspired by your progress. But you can't really change them in a very targeted manner. So you should change yourself, which is the only parameter that can be influenced in a very targeted manner. This is why the Buddha said, when he was comparing different kinds of people, that the person who tries to fix themselves is superior to the person who tries to fix another. The person who tries to fix neither of those is obviously far inferior to any kind of people, and the person who tries to fix both is superior. But that person first has to fix themselves, and then they can fix other people. So that is very important to keep in mind. And the Buddha also said in Majjhima Nikaya number 8 that one who is himself thinking in the mud could pull out another. That is impossible. But one who is not thinking in the mud, he could pull out another person and help them get rid of the defilements, as an example or a simile for teaching the Dhamma. This is what the Buddha pretty much said. And again, this is very important and points to that very important thing. If you want to help another person escape suffering, then you have to understand the Dhamma first, which is a way out of suffering. And nowadays, this is very important. There are monks who have not attained the right view, know that, and are very important about that, and still give Dhamma talks. And this is very strange to me, because they don't know the way out of suffering, but they seemingly teach it. They can't teach it because they have not understood it. It's basically impossible to even understand the suttas properly without having the inside knowledge of the right view of dependent origination. Only based on that can anything about the Dhamma really be understood. At that moment where you understand dependent origination, you suddenly understand the vocabulary the Buddha was using. Without that insight, it's just meaningless words to you, because you have no experience you can map those words to, which is, again, very important. But let us now come to the very important chapter, and maybe the most important chapter for someone who has not yet attained the mundane right view, namely to the chapter or section on fingers to the moon. And this is a section on why understanding is hard and what is the hard part about it. And the Buddha, when asked, said that wrong view or ignorance is the worst of all hindrances and the most blameworthy thing. If you think, for example, you know how something works, then you will make no additional effort at finding out the truth. And this can block all spiritual progress for the foreseeable future. And misunderstanding overall is very much fueled by wrong view. When you have very wrong underlying assumptions, then the result can only be something wrong too. And communication overall is a huge aid for learning. Without communication, we cannot really make a breakthrough to the Dhamma, because that would make us a Buddha. But nowadays we have the teachings of the Buddha still around, and it's much more likely to just encounter them in any form when you are looking for the truth. Even when the Buddha went out looking for the liberation from suffering, he first tried to find other people who already have understood the Dhamma and claimed awakening. In the end, they were not awakened, but this is another different story. Well, right now, awakening is possible because there is true Dhamma around. So you can actually go and look for it and then see for yourself if it is still working. But yeah, communication overall sadly rarely works as intended, as we normally communicate and misunderstand and misconceive through our craving. If we had no craving, then we could probably understand very well what the Buddha, as an example, we're talking about. But without that very strong, very weak craving, we cannot really understand. We always misconceive what others are saying, and there are very frequent communication errors. And as an example, in science, people pretty much invented mathematics to avoid such errors. Mathematics is essentially just a very precise and accurate language to communicate about very hard to understand topics, just to make it simpler to communicate in a very precise way. But yeah, the entire problem behind all of this is basically that we have wrong mental models. And modern politics is a prime example of this kind of misunderstanding or of having wrong mental models. And this is why I basically always advise people to just stop consuming any kind of political material, because there's quite literally not anything good in it. Not anything of benefit, at least when it comes to Dhamma. When you are a politician, sure, watch it. You have to, but you have to live with the consequences of a mind that is very corrupt and that is very defiled with all the political views and all those things out there. But in essence, our mind likes to change our view as little as possible due to our inherent energy conservation drive. And thinking, overall, works based on axioms and known facts. And we do presuppose everything we know in other people. Once we learn how to add numbers, it is suddenly super simple and everyone has to find it super simple, even though it was quite difficult at a time where people discovered it. It's just that we teach it to young school children nowadays, so we just assume that it is easy. But those mental models of ours, those axioms our entire thinking is based on, can be wrong. It is just that we never question those things. And in addition to that, a simple wrong knowledge, we often mistake views and people. So we think that a person and the view is basically the same thing. And yeah, this is a rather big problem, because we cannot really separate information from the person who is saying something. When we have a person who is saying something and we dislike that person, then we automatically assume that that piece of information is wrong, simply based on our craving. We don't like that person. There is a negative feeling. We crave that person to go away, and thus we also associate that piece of information with that person, and suddenly the information is wrong, even though the information in itself could be liberating you from suffering. But you cannot accept it because it is disagreeable to you, because the person is disagreeable to you, and by implication, that piece of information is also disagreeable to you. And this is basically one of the biggest hindrances out there. Even if someone serves you the purest Dhamma on a golden or silver plate, you could not accept it if it came from the wrong person, if your craving is still too strong. And this is a very, very big hindrance. And then again, there are still other problems, namely words mean simply different things to people. And this is a problem we will talk a lot about in the next few slides. Words are just pointers to mental models. And when in question, it is always a good idea to give someone else the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, in essence, I want to convey with this slide how the entire process of learning new mental models work. Whenever we perceive something in the world, as an example, through our senses, then there is a mental model created. And this mental model is basically just a cloud of associations. For example, we learn the mental model of a tree, and that mental model is a bit different from the real trees that we are seeing. It has certain qualities and gets associated with similar things in the mind. For example, this could be a small tree, an oak tree, part of a forest, or pretty boring. And as you can see by the colors, the thing that we perceive already has an emotional valuation attached to it that comes with the very perception. And the evaluation in the middle is basically the sum of the valuations of the associations. So this one might be very boring, so that the thing in the middle is a bit bad evaluated. So those valuations, those green and red things, can just be good, bad, and neutral. It can be white, it can be red, and it can be shades of green, basically. So, but overall, it is always one of those three things. It is either good, bad, or neutral. That's the role of evaluation. And whenever we perceive anything, such mental models are created in the mind. But the problem now is that those mental models are very, very different from person to person, simply based on what those people know. The sum of the known things of people is very different. As an example, here we have the mind map that some person might have learned in the United States about the former president, Donald Trump. this map might be colored very, very negatively because he's a very polarizing person. And in the end, those valuations are kind of arbitrary. Some other person who is a big Trump supporter might think entirely different about those persons. And the entire mind map, the entire map of associations will be very different. And when you now talk to another person about Donald Trump, then your judgment about Donald Trump will be very different. And even the sentences that you are exchanging are very different. And in this case, this person has a very negative view of the former President Donald Trump. And there are lots of associations like social justice warriors. He's a man, and that might be a problem. He's a politician. He has too much money. All the business failures in the past might be a problem, and the media scandals. But he might have a good view of America as a whole. So overall, he has a pretty negative view of Donald Trump. And another person has a very, very different mind map in their heads. Another cloud of associations. And this might be the source of all the problems. Because now when we use the word Donald Trump in a sentence, then we could say the same words to different people, and they will have an entirely different meaning in their minds triggered. Because the words that we use are just the pointers to those clouds of associations. So when we say Trump plays golf, one person that dislikes Trump and engages a lot in online politics will maybe have the former association triggered. Namely, the president of the United States or the former president of the United States is again wasting time playing golf. Yet another person who is not engaging in online politics, who plays a lot of video games, will have an entirely different association triggered in their mind. For them, Trump is associated with the person on the right, which is Trump SC, which is a streamer of the game Hearthstone and many other games. And when you say Trump plays golf, you think, well, maybe Wii golf or some golf video game. But the point is, the same words have been used in the communication process, but the meaning that has been communicated is completely different. And the only thing that can fix this process is your own self-honesty and your own knowledge that there might have been something wrong going on, that the person who is telling us a sentence, Trump plays golf, might be meaning something completely different. So when there is doubt, you can ask based on that self-honesty. But a person who has not cultivated that sense of self-honesty and that sense of being able to admit that you might have misunderstood something, then you will never question that. Then you will not even know that it is a possibility that another person might have meant something completely different. And when we take that entire topic and apply it to spirituality, it should be very, very clear what can go wrong. When a spiritual teacher, for example, says to us, feelings just arise, or feeling just arises, then that spiritual teacher has a very different mental model from us when it comes to all of this. And this is very, very important. Because in the end, the liberation the Buddha was talking about is an understanding. Once we have the correct mind map, so to speak, in our minds, then we are completely free from suffering. But as long as that is not the case, for example, the Buddha at the top might talk about those very mind maps, and another person, some anonymous person like us, hears that sentence and has a completely different mind map. But since we know the words, since we know the word feeling and just arises, and it has a meaning for us, we just assume that we understand, while we don't understand at all. And this is the biggest hindrance of them all that I know of. Because in the beginning, my mind was working like that too. I just saw, feelings, of course. Hate, rage, sadness. Clear, of course I know what feelings are. And when he says just arises, arising, I know that word. And then I assumed that I have understood the meaning, but I have not understood it at all. So this might be the most important slide for spiritual progress of the early kind. Without understanding this problem, right view is impossible. You require many iterations of contemplation and trying to understand to really align your understanding of what feelings are with the understanding of the Buddha. And once you did fully understand that, you are basically an arahant, or at least have attained the right view. This is why it is all about understanding. You have to have the right associations in your mind. You have to have the right understanding, basically. But if you take that idea a bit further, you want to perfectly align the bottom left square, which is what feeling really is, as an example, with your idea of what feeling is. And in the beginning, there will be at best a very small overlap between those two different squares that stand for your understanding. of feelings. And feelings is just one example of many. There are a lot of words that the Buddha was talking about. There are these 3 marks of existence, there is suffering, there are all kinds of those words. And for each of those words, this kind of problem occurs. So whenever the Buddha talks about suffering, he very likely means something different from what you assume he's talking about. And then there is suffering with a big D, with a capital D, and suffering with a small d. And both mean completely different things. And most people don't even know that most of the time. And as a result, we have a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of people who are very much stagnating in their understanding and in the insight when it comes to progress towards the liberation from suffering. And this might be the very core of the problem. People assume they understand, but they don't really understand at all. The only real judge we have when it comes to our understanding is our ability to suffer. Do we still suffer? If the answer is yes, then we have still problems left. Suffering is our ultimate teacher. But anyway, the entire problem behind of this is illustrated in this small exercise that I also want to give you. Again, the top part should be done first, and the lower part is the explanation. So first of all, try to think of a stop sign. There are a lot of letters on such a stop sign. It has a color, typically it's very red. Sometimes the shape is hexagonal or something, and it has a position in space. It stands somewhere. However, where in that sign is the information that you should halt your car when you encounter such a sign on the road? Again, maybe pause the video and ponder a bit about it. But the answer is very clear. After a while, it should be clear, at least to most people who have some understanding about philosophy. The information is in your mind and exists in relation to the material world. Knowledge and understanding, they are semantics. They are understanding. They cannot be found in the sensual objects themselves. The syntax is defined by distinguishable physical manifestations of things, like letters on a piece of paper, letters on a screen, letters on a stop sign or anything like that. And the semantics, the meaning, this is in our mind. And any matter that can be distinguished from its surroundings can also be assigned a meaning. However, that meaning is a property of your mind and not a property of the object in question. And this is very important and also applies to the same words that I have been using in the example before. Again, very crucial. Without it, it's impossible to make progress on the spiritual path. But anyway, now to a very important slide. It is not just that we misunderstand other people, which is also a conclusion we might come to, that we just misunderstand our spiritual teacher. And this is a problem. But this is not true. The biggest kind of misunderstanding happens towards ourselves. We think we understand something, but don't. And as soon as we know a word, we stop questioning if we know something rightly and just assume that our understanding of those words is the same as the understanding of another person. And having a meaning for a word is enough for us to stop any effort at understanding, because our energy conservation drive will always jump to the conclusion, oh yeah, we have understood that. Because again, it is unpleasant to learn. It is unpleasant to refine our understanding. And very related to that is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which just means that people have the feeling that they understood a lot of a topic simply because they know the words, or they know a lot of the words they associate with one topic. They do not know what they don't know. And if we understand something and we understood something, we usually mistake it for everything. And there is a huge difference between the one mental model that is right and really what the Buddha, for example, wanted to teach, and the other mental model that we have understood. And intellectually, we have to have a lot of self-honesty to frequently self-inquire and test if we really understood something. And most people do not have that kind of necessary self-honesty and responsibility and all those qualities to actually make progress on the spiritual path. And this is one of the biggest problems nowadays. Because people really think that it is some magical experience that you get from meditation, some great pleasure or something like that, or rainbow auras even, or some opening chakra. That is what the Buddha meant with liberation. But it is not at all. And yeah, it really is an understanding. And this really is freedom from suffering regardless of the circumstances, not just on the meditation cushion. That's like being a prisoner that has one day where he can walk and enjoy the world outside, but still he's confined to the prison. That's not liberation, that is just temporary absence of suffering. But anyway, Now we would come to the right view before Sotapaddi. Sotapaddi is the stream entry, pretty much, the understanding of the Dhamma. And there is a right view the Buddha was talking about before Sotapaddi. And he said that right view is of two kinds, the mundane kind and the supramundane kind. The supramundane kind is Sotapaddi, which is stream entry, which is another word for right view, etc. There are many synonyms that we will also go through. But this type of right view is a necessary precondition we are talking about. The mundane right view is necessary to attain the real right view. And he distinguished between those two. And this is what we will discuss next time. This time around, we stop here because I think we have spent enough time on this lecture. And now we have some time for questions and answers. So if there is something that you find unclear, or something that you want to know, or something that you think other people could benefit from, if you asked that question, feel free to write it down in the comment section, and I will gather all those questions and answer them with a noble friend of mine or myself, so that other people can also benefit from your questions. But anyway, I think that is enough for today. If you enjoy what I do here with this lecture, feel free to recommend it to other people who might also benefit from some Dhamma that is actually Dhamma and not just what people nowadays call Dhamma. But anyway, I think that is enough for today. Thank you very much for watching. Have a nice day and goodbye.